The morning after the fire, Eleanor Whitmore stood in the charred remains of what had been her home for 23 years, watching smoke still rise from the blackened timbers. Everything was gone. Her late husband's books, her grandmother's china, the rocking chair where she'd nursed her children. The autumn wind carried the acrid smell of destruction across the valley, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt truly alone. From the tree line emerged a figure she'd seen only in passing, Caleb Morrison, the mountain man who lived in solitude above the ridge. His weathered hands carried an axe and a carpenter's determination that spoke of rebuilding rather than mourning. He'd lost his own family to tragedy years ago, retreating to the wilderness to escape memories that refused to fade. Neither suspected that rebuilding her house would unearth secrets that had been buried for decades. What truth was Eleanor hiding that could change everything they thought they knew about love and redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Whitmore had never imagined she would outlive her house. At 52, she possessed the kind of weathered beauty that came from decades of mountain living. Hands calloused from garden work, skin kissed by high-altitude sun, and eyes that held depths of experience, both joyful and sorrowful. Her auburn hair, now streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun that had become her signature since Thomas's death 3 years prior. The house that now lay in ruins had been their dream, built log by log when they were young and hopeful. Thomas Whitmore had been a gentleman with carpenter's hands and a farmer's patience. Together, they had carved out a life in the Montana territory that was simple but fulfilling. Their homestead sat in a natural clearing where the valley floor met the foothills, protected from the worst winds but open to southern light that warmed their kitchen windows each morning. Thomas's pocket watch lay somewhere in the ashes, stopped forever at 2:15 in the afternoon. The exact moment 3 years ago when his labored breathing had finally ceased. Eleanor had kept it on the mantelpiece, its silent face a reminder that some things, once broken, could never be mended. The consumption had taken him slowly, giving them time to say goodbye, but making each day a painful countdown to inevitability. From her position among the ruins, Eleanor could see Caleb Morrison approaching with measured steps. She knew little about him beyond local gossip and occasional glimpses during her rare trips to town. At 45, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen combat, though he'd lived as a hermit for the better part of a decade. His dark hair and beard showed threads of grey, and his blue eyes held a wariness that spoke of loss. The community knew fragments of his story, enough to respect his privacy but maintain their distance. He had been a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Benton during the Indian conflicts. His wife Sarah and young daughter Mary had been killed during a raid while he was away on patrol. The guilt and grief had driven him to the mountains, where he built a cabin above the tree line and lived off the land with minimal contact with civilization. Yet here he stood, axe in hand, studying the destruction with the calculating gaze of someone who saw solutions rather than problems. Eleanor had always maintained her independence fiercely, even after Thomas's death. She had learned to chop her own wood, tend her own garden, and handle the countless small repairs that homestead life demanded. But looking at the complete devastation before her, she felt her self-reliance crumble like the charred timbers at her feet. "Mrs. Whitmore," Caleb said, his voice carrying the rough texture of disuse. "I heard about the fire from Peterson when he rode through yesterday. I wanted to offer my assistance." Eleanor studied his face, searching for pity or obligation, but finding neither. His expression held only the practical concern of one neighbor for another, tinged with an understanding that came from personal experience with loss. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison, but I couldn't possibly accept—" "You could," he interrupted gently. "And you should. This isn't charity, Mrs. Whitmore. It's what neighbors do for each other when disaster strikes. You'd do the same for me if circumstances were reversed." The truth of his words settled over her like a blanket. She would indeed help if their situations were switched, would consider it not only proper, but essential. The mountain code demanded mutual assistance in times of crisis, regardless of personal preferences for solitude or independence. "I have timber on my land," Caleb continued, gesturing toward the forested slopes above them. "Good lodgepole pine already seasoned. I know building techniques that will make the new structure stronger than the original. And frankly, Mrs. Whitmore, I could use the work. A man needs purpose, and I've been without it for too long." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight control she'd maintained since Thomas's death. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was recognition of a kindred spirit who understood the weight of solitary grief. Either way, she found herself nodding before her pride could object. "Very well, Mr. Morrison, I accept your offer. Though I insist on contributing whatever labor I'm capable of providing." A smile crossed his weathered features, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Mrs. Whitmore. We'll start tomorrow at first light, if that suits you." As evening approached and Caleb departed for his mountain cabin, Eleanor stood alone among the ashes of her old life, unexpectedly hopeful about the prospect of building something new. True to his word, Caleb arrived at Eleanor's property as the first rays of sunlight painted the mountain peaks gold. He carried his tools in a worn leather satchel that had seen years of faithful service, and his movements held the purposeful efficiency of a man accustomed to working alone. Eleanor had risen early herself, brewing coffee over the small campfire she'd built near what used to be her kitchen garden. "I thought we might start by sorting through what can be salvaged," Caleb said, accepting the tin cup of coffee she offered. His hands were steady despite the early hour, and Eleanor noticed the careful way he held the cup, not from any weakness, but with the deliberate control of someone who had learned to manage strong emotions. As they worked through the debris, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at her unexpected partner. There was something calming about his presence, a quiet competence that reminded her of Thomas, but without the painful overlay of memory and loss. Caleb moved through the ruins methodically, setting aside anything that might be useful or meaningful, never rushing her when she paused over a particular item. "Tell me about the original structure," he said, crouching beside what had been the foundation. "How many rooms, what materials Thomas used? Any particular challenges he faced with the site?" Eleanor walked him through the layout, the main room that served as kitchen and gathering space, the smaller bedroom where she and Thomas had shared 20 years of marriage, the root cellar that had somehow survived the fire intact. As she spoke, she watched Caleb's face, seeing him process the information with the focus of a man who understood building not just as construction, but as the creation of sanctuary. "Thomas always said the foundation was too shallow," she admitted. "We had some settling issues in the third year, cracks in the interior walls. He planned to address it eventually, but there was always something more pressing demanding attention." Caleb nodded, running his hands along the charred stone foundation. "Common mistake with homestead construction. The urgency to get shelter built often means cutting corners that cause problems later. We'll dig deeper this time, set it right." There was something in his tone that made Eleanor pause. "We, if you'll have me as a partner in this endeavor," Caleb said, looking up from his examination of the stonework. "I know I offered to help, Mrs. Whitmore, but the more I think about this project, the more I realize it's exactly what I need. I've been existing rather than living for too many years. Building something meaningful, something that will shelter and comfort someone who deserves both. That would be a gift to me as much as to you." Eleanor studied his face, seeing past the beard and the weathered features to something deeper. There was a loneliness in his eyes that matched her own, a hunger for purpose and connection that mountain solitude couldn't satisfy indefinitely. "What happened to your family, Mr. Morrison?" she asked quietly. "If you don't mind my asking." Caleb was silent for a long moment, his hands still as he stared at the foundation stones. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful control of someone recounting facts rather than reliving emotions. "Sarah and Mary were at the homestead while I was on patrol with my unit. Blackfoot raiders came through the valley. They weren't supposed to be that far south, but borders meant little to desperate men facing a harsh winter. Zara tried to defend our cabin with my old rifle, but he paused, swallowing hard. I found them 3 days later when we returned from the patrol. Eleanor felt her heart constrict with sympathy. I'm so sorry. Mary would have been 15 now, Caleb continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah used to say she had my stubborn streak, but her mother's wisdom. I wonder what kind of young woman she would have become. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Eleanor recognized the particular quality of grief that came from wondering about unlived lives. Roads not taken, conversations that would never happen. Thomas and I never had children, she said finally. We tried for years, hoped and prayed and grieved each disappointment. Eventually, we accepted that our family would be just the two of us, and we made peace with that choice. But I understand the wondering about what might have been. Caleb looked at her with new understanding, recognizing a fellow traveler on the difficult path of loss and acceptance. Perhaps, he said carefully, we can help each other build something new from what remains. Eleanor extended her hand, and when Caleb took it, she felt the calluses that spoke of years of honest work, the strength that came from enduring hardship without breaking. Partners then, she said. In rebuilding, partners, he agreed, and Eleanor thought she saw the ghost of the man he had been before tragedy changed his course. The work of clearing began in earnest the following morning. Eleanor had prepared herself for the emotional toll of sorting through the physical remnants of her life with Thomas, but she hadn't anticipated how different the process would feel with Caleb's steady presence beside her. Where she might have rushed through painful discoveries or avoided them altogether, his methodical approach forced her to confront each piece of her past with proper attention. Here, Caleb said, carefully lifting a section of collapsed roof timber. Something underneath. Eleanor peered into the gap he'd created and felt her breath catch. Partially buried in ash, but miraculously intact, was Thomas's toolbox, a sturdy oak container he'd built himself during their second year of marriage. The wood was scorched and darkened, but the tight-fitting lid had protected the contents from the worst of the fire's destruction. With trembling fingers, Eleanor opened the familiar latches. Inside, Thomas's hand tools lay nestled in their appointed places. The set of chisels he'd inherited from his father, the hand plane that had smoothed countless boards, the measuring square that ensured true angles. Each tool bore the patina of decades of use, the wear patterns that spoke of a craftsman's devotion to his trade. He would have wanted you to have these, Eleanor said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. Thomas always said tools should go to someone who would use them properly, who would respect what they could create. Caleb accepted the toolbox with the reverence of one craftsman receiving the instruments of another. I'll honor them, he said simply. And I'll honor him by using them to build something worthy. As they continued working, Eleanor found herself sharing memories prompted by each discovery. A bent silver spoon triggered the story of their first Christmas dinner, when she'd burned the turkey and they'd eaten beans and cornbread while laughing until their sides ached. A fragment of blue pottery brought back the afternoon Thomas had surprised her with a set of dishes ordered all the way from Denver. His shy pride at being able to provide something beautiful rather than merely functional. You loved him deeply, Caleb observed during one of these recollections. It wasn't a question, but a statement of recognition from someone who understood the particular quality of grief that follows profound love. I did, Eleanor confirmed. But it was a quiet love, built on shared work and mutual respect more than passion. We were partners in the truest sense, each of us pulling our own weight, working toward common goals. She paused, considering her words. It was a good marriage, solid and dependable. I don't regret a moment of it, Caleb nodded, understanding the distinction she was making. Not all love burned with consuming fire. Some glowed with the steady warmth of a well-tended hearth. Both had their place in a life well lived. Near what had been the bedroom, Eleanor's careful composure finally cracked. Among the debris, she spotted the glint of metal and realized it was her wedding ring, somehow separated from her finger during the chaos of fighting the fire. The simple gold band was tarnished but unbroken, a circle of promises that had endured 20 years of mountain weather and hard work. I thought it was lost forever, she whispered, clutching the ring against her chest. For reasons she couldn't quite articulate, she didn't slip it back onto her finger. Instead, she tucked it carefully into her apron pocket, where it rested like a talisman of her past, rather than a chain binding her to it. Caleb pretended not to notice her tears, busying himself with organizing the salvaged items into categories: materials that could be reused in construction, personal belongings to be cleaned and preserved, and debris destined for burning. His tact touched Eleanor more than sympathy would have. He understood that grief needed both acknowledgement and space. As the day progressed, their working rhythm evolved naturally. Caleb's strength made quick work of the heavy lifting, while Eleanor's intimate knowledge of the house guided their priorities. They developed an unspoken communication, a gesture here, a glance there, that spoke of two people learning to work as a team. "Tomorrow we'll start on the foundation," Caleb said as evening shadows lengthened across the clearing. "I'll need to dig deeper than Thomas did originally, set the stones in mortar for better stability. It'll be hard work, but it'll ensure the new house stands for generations." Eleanor looked at the cleared space where her home had stood, then at the modest pile of salvaged belongings that represented the tangible remains of her old life. For the first time since the fire, she felt something other than loss. "Generations," she repeated thoughtfully. "I like the sound of that." As Caleb gathered his tools and prepared for the trek back to his mountain cabin, Eleanor remained among the cleared ruins, her wedding ring warm in her pocket and possibility stirring in her heart. The sound of Caleb's pickaxe striking earth created a steady rhythm that echoed across the valley as he worked to excavate the new foundation. Eleanor had risen before dawn to prepare a hearty breakfast, understanding that the physical demands of construction required proper nourishment. She found satisfaction in this return to purposeful routine, even if the circumstances were far different from the domestic patterns she'd established during her marriage. "Deeper than I expected," Caleb called from the excavation, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "The frost line drops further in this valley than I initially calculated. Better to be safe than sorry when it comes to winter stability." Eleanor approached the edge of the foundation trench, impressed by the precision of his work. The walls were perfectly straight, the corners forming true right angles that would have made Thomas proud. Caleb worked with the methodical care of someone who understood that a foundation's integrity determined everything that followed. "You're skilled at this," she observed. "More skilled than most men who claim building experience. My father was a stone mason back in Pennsylvania," Caleb explained, resuming his digging. "He insisted I learn proper technique before I was old enough to argue. Said any fool could stack rocks, but it took knowledge to make them last." He paused, a distant look crossing his features. "I haven't thought about his lessons in years, but my hands seem to remember what my mind forgot." As Eleanor helped carry away buckets of excavated soil, she marveled at how naturally they'd fallen into complementary roles. Where Thomas had been protective of her involvement in heavy work, Caleb simply accepted her contributions without comment or concern. He handed her tasks based on capability rather than gender, treating her as a full partner in the enterprise. "Mrs. Whitmore," came a voice from behind them. Eleanor turned to see Agnes Peterson approaching, her face bearing the expression of someone bringing important news. Ignis lived closest to town and served as the unofficial messenger for community happenings. "Agnes, good morning," Eleanor replied, wiping her hands on her work apron. "What brings you out so early?" "Wanted to see how the work was progressing," Agnes said, though her eyes kept drifting to Caleb's figure in the foundation trench. Also thought you should know, there's been talk in town about your arrangement here. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen. What sort of talk? Agnes glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. Some folks are wondering if it's proper, you and Mr. Morrison working so closely together. A widow and a bachelor, spending all this time alone together. You know how people's minds work. From the foundation trench came the sound of Caleb's pickaxe striking something solid. Not earth or rock, but something that rang with a different tone. All three women turned toward the sound. Found something, Caleb called, his voice carrying a note of curiosity. He knelt in the trench, carefully brushing soil away from whatever he'd uncovered. Eleanor climbed down into the excavation, her heart beating faster with an anxiety she couldn't quite name. Agnes followed, her earlier gossip forgotten in the face of discovery. Partially buried beneath what would have been the original floorboards was a small wooden object, clearly hand-carved and polished smooth by handling. As Caleb lifted it carefully from the earth, Eleanor recognized it immediately. A child's toy horse, complete with tiny saddle and bridle carved in exquisite detail. How beautiful, Agnes breathed. Must have been dropped by a previous owner, but Eleanor knew better. Her hands trembled as she reached for the toy, memories flooding back with painful clarity. She had carved this horse herself, working secretly during the long winter evenings when Thomas was occupied with his own projects. Every curve of the mane, every detail of the tack had been crafted with infinite care and boundless hope. Eleanor, Caleb's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? She clutched the wooden horse against her chest, feeling the smooth surfaces that had once been polished by small fingers that would never grow larger. The toy represented dreams that had died before they could fully form, hopes buried so deeply she'd almost convinced herself they'd never existed. I need a moment, she managed, climbing quickly out of the foundation trench. Agnes and Caleb exchanged worried glances as Eleanor walked toward the tree line. The toy horse clutched in her hands, like a relic from a life she'd tried to forget. Behind her, she heard Agnes whisper to Caleb, "Did you know she and Thomas had lost a child?" "No," Caleb replied quietly. "She never mentioned it." Eleanor leaned against the rough bark of a pine tree, closing her eyes as the weight of buried grief settled over her like a familiar but unwelcome shawl. Eleanor remained by the pine tree for nearly an hour, the wooden horse warm in her palm as she wrestled with memories she'd spent decades trying to bury. When she finally returned to the construction site, Agnes had departed, and Caleb was laying the first course of foundation stones with methodical precision. He looked up as she approached, but didn't pepper her with questions, for which she felt grateful. "The stones are setting well," she said, attempting normalcy while still clutching the toy horse. "Good granite from the quarry up valley," Caleb replied, matching her tone. "Should last longer than either of us will be around to see." They worked in companionable silence for most of the morning, but Eleanor could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them. Finally, as they broke for the noon meal she'd prepared, Caleb set down his tools and faced her directly. "Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time, "you don't owe me explanations about your past, but if there's something about this house, this site, that's going to cause you pain, I need to know. I won't be party to building you a prison of bad memories." Eleanor studied his weathered face, seeing genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. There was something about his direct honesty that made deception feel impossible, even the kind of protective deception she'd practiced for so many years. "There are things about my life that I've never told anyone," she said slowly. "Things that happened before I married Thomas, things that shaped who I became, but that I've kept hidden out of shame and fear." Caleb nodded, settling beside her on the log they'd been using as a bench. "We all have those kinds of secrets. Question is whether keeping them buried serves any useful purpose, or whether they just poison the ground they're planted in." Eleanor looked down at the wooden horse in her hands, running her thumb along its carved mane. "I wasn't always Eleanor Whitmore, respectable widow of a good man. Before Thomas, I was Eleanor Hayes, unwed mother, fallen woman, the kind of person decent folks cross the street to avoid. The admission hung in the air between them, and Eleanor braced herself for the change in Caleb's expression that she'd feared for so many years. Instead, she saw only patient attention, the look of someone prepared to listen without judgment. I was 17 when I met Jonathan Hayes, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He was handsome and charming and full of dreams about striking it rich in the California goldfields. I was young and foolish and completely besotted with him. She paused, gathering courage for the hardest part of her story. We were engaged to be married. I believed every promise he made about our future together. When I discovered I was carrying his child, Jonathan swore he'd return from California with enough gold to build us a proper life. He left in the spring of 1862, promising to be back before the baby was born. Caleb remained silent, but she felt his attention like a physical presence. Steady and non-judgmental, I spent those months working for a seamstress in town, saving every penny and waiting for letters that came less and less frequently. The baby was born in November, a beautiful little boy I named Samuel. For 3 months, I lived in a rented room above the dress shop, taking in piecework and caring for my son. Eleanor's voice caught, and she had to pause before continuing. Fever took him in February. One day he was laughing and reaching for my face. The next he was burning with temperature I couldn't break. There was no doctor, no medicine that helped. I held him as he died, this perfect little person who never had a chance to become who he was meant to be. She held up the wooden horse, its carved surface blurring through her tears. I made this for him during those long winter nights when he couldn't sleep. It was going to be his first Christmas present, something made with a mother's love. After he died, I couldn't bear to keep it, but I couldn't bear to throw it away either. So I buried it beneath our cabin, thinking it would rest there forever. Caleb reached over and gently covered her hand with his, the warmth of his touch anchoring her to the present moment. Thomas found me 6 months later, broken and desperate and carrying more shame than one person should bear. He offered marriage not out of love but out of kindness, giving me respectability and a fresh start. I never told him about Samuel, never told him about the toy horse buried beneath our floor. It felt like betraying both my son's memory and Thomas's generosity. And Jonathan? Caleb asked quietly. Never returned. Never even wrote to acknowledge his son's existence or death. Eleanor's voice carried decades of accumulated hurt and anger. I learned later that he'd married a banker's daughter in Sacramento, started a new family with someone whose past was clean and uncomplicated. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, processing her revelation. Eleanor, he said finally, thank you for trusting me with this. And I want you to know, nothing you've told me changes how I see you. If anything, it makes me respect your strength even more. Over the following weeks, the framework of Eleanor's new house began to take shape with remarkable speed. Caleb's expertise with timber construction became evident in every joint and beam, each piece fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. Eleanor found herself genuinely helpful rather than merely present, her smaller hands perfect for holding pieces in place while he secured them. Her eye for detail catching potential problems before they became costly mistakes. The physical work proved therapeutic in ways Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The rhythm of sawing and hammering, the satisfaction of seeing progress measured in tangible construction, helped quiet the emotional turmoil that had followed her confession about Samuel. Caleb's acceptance of her past had lifted a weight she'd carried for so long that she'd forgotten how heavy it was. "Hand me that level," Caleb called from his position atop the wall frame. Eleanor passed up the brass instrument, watching as he checked the trueness of the beam placement with the careful attention to detail that characterized all his work. "Perfect," he declared, and Eleanor felt an unexpected flush of pride at being part of something built so well. As they worked to install the window frames, Caleb began sharing more of his own story. His military service had taken him to remote outposts throughout the frontier, and he'd learned building techniques from German settlers, Norwegian homesteaders, and native craftsmen whose methods had been refined over generations. The key, he explained as they fitted a window frame into its opening, is understanding that a house isn't just shelter. It's a partnership between human needs and natural forces. Work with the materials rather than against them. Respect the environment you're building in, and the structure will serve you for decades. During their lunch break, Eleanor noticed Caleb examining a small object he'd pulled from his shirt pocket. When she looked closer, she realized it was a silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful in its delicate craftsmanship. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the locket. Caleb hesitated for just a moment before handing it to her. The locket opened to reveal a tin-type photograph that made Eleanor's breath catch. A young woman with gentle eyes and a serious expression sat beside a small girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Both wore their finest dresses, and the little girl's hand rested on her mother's arm with touching trust. "Sarah and Mary," Caleb said quietly, taken the Christmas before they died. Mary insisted on wearing her best dress, said she wanted to look pretty for Papa's picture. Eleanor studied the faces of Caleb's lost family, seeing echoes of his features in the child's face and understanding why he'd retreated to the mountains rather than face daily reminders of such profound loss. "They were beautiful," she said, closing the locket carefully and returning it to him. "Mary has your eyes. She had Sarah's temperament, though. Curious about everything, fearless in her explorations. Sarah used to worry that Mary would wander too far from the cabin someday, get lost in the woods, or encounter something dangerous." His voice cracked slightly. It never occurred to either of us that danger would come to our door instead. Eleanor reached over and placed her hand on his arm, offering comfort through touch when words seemed inadequate. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, each lost in thoughts of children who would never grow up, futures that had been cut short by circumstances beyond parental control. "Do you think," Eleanor asked eventually, "that we dishonor their memory by learning to be happy again?" Caleb considered her question seriously. "I used to think so, felt like forgetting them or betraying them somehow. But lately, I've wondered if the opposite might be true. Maybe the best way to honor them is to prove that love doesn't die when people do, that it can grow and change and find new expressions." As afternoon sunlight slanted through the completed window frames, casting geometric patterns on the subflooring, Eleanor felt something shifting in her understanding of herself and her capacity for future happiness. The house they were building together felt different from the one Thomas had constructed, not better or worse, but infused with different hopes and possibilities. "Caleb," she said, surprising herself with her boldness, "would you stay for supper tonight? I know you usually return to your cabin before dark, but I'd enjoy the company." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between surprise and pleasure and perhaps a touch of concern. "Are you sure? People will talk if my horse is seen here after nightfall." Eleanor thought of Agnes Peterson's earlier warnings about propriety and community gossip, then dismissed them with a mental shrug. "Let them talk. I'm past the age where other people's opinions should dictate my choices." "In that case," Caleb said, his smile transforming his weathered features, "I'd be honored to stay." The installation of windows had become Eleanor's favorite part of the construction process. Each opening cut into the walls represented a portal between the protected interior and the larger world, framing views that would become part of daily life for years to come. As Caleb carefully fitted the final window frame into the kitchen wall, Eleanor imagined standing at this spot on future mornings, watching the sun rise over the valley while she prepared breakfast. "These windows will let in twice as much light as your original house," Caleb observed, adjusting the frame's position with minute precision. "Sarah always complained about dark kitchens, said a woman needed proper light for cooking and preserving, not to mention the simple pleasure of seeing the world while she worked." Eleanor helped him secure the frame, noting how naturally he'd begun sharing memories of his wife. The sharp edges of his grief seemed to be softening, allowing room for fondness alongside the pain. Thomas was practical about windows, she said. He figured they let in light, but also let out heat, so smaller was better for winter efficiency. I always wished for more brightness, but I never said anything. Seemed ungrateful to complain about the house he'd worked so hard to build. As they cleaned up the day's wood shavings and sawdust, Caleb paused near the area where they'd discovered the toy horse. "Eleanor, there's something I found yesterday while checking the foundation stones. Something I think you should see." He led her to the section of foundation where the original house's bedroom had stood, then knelt and carefully extracted something from behind a loose stone. When he straightened, he held a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Clearly hidden with deliberate care many years ago, Eleanor's hands trembled as she unwrapped the bundle, revealing a folded document that bore official seals and formal script. As she opened it, the words swimming before her eyes told a story she'd hoped would remain buried forever. Certificate of Live Birth. State of Montana Territory, Samuel Jonathan Hayes. Born November 15, 1862. Mother Eleanor Hayes. Father Jonathan Hayes. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see it," Caleb said gently. But it seemed wrong to leave it hidden. Eleanor stared at the document. Seeing Samuel's name written in official script, proof of his brief existence that she'd hidden behind the foundation stone when she married Thomas. She'd been terrified that someone might discover it, might connect Eleanor Hayes to Eleanor Whitmore and destroy the respectable life Thomas had offered her. "I was so ashamed," she whispered. Not of Samuel, never of him, but of the circumstances. An unmarried mother in 1862 was barely a step above a prostitute in most people's minds. Thomas never asked about my past, never demanded details about my life before we met. I think he suspected there were things I wasn't telling him, but he respected my privacy. Caleb sat beside her on the foundation stones, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "You were protecting yourself and honoring the man who'd given you a second chance. There's no shame in that, but there's no honesty in it either," Eleanor replied, refolding the birth certificate with careful hands. "I built my marriage to Thomas on the foundation of everything I didn't tell him. Maybe that's why I sometimes felt like we were living on the surface of things, never quite reaching the deeper currents of real intimacy." She looked around at the framework of her new house, seeing it suddenly as more than mere construction. "This house we're building, I want it to be different. I want it to be built on truth instead of concealment, on authentic connection rather than polite distance." Caleb turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious in the afternoon light. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" "I'm saying that if we're going to continue building together, the house and whatever else might grow between us, then you deserve to know everything, all of it, the complete truth about who I was and what I've done, and why I've spent so many years hiding from my own history." She stood and walked to the window opening that would frame her view of the valley, gathering courage for the final revelations that would either drive Caleb away or bind them together with unbreakable honesty. "Samuel wasn't the only secret I buried when I married Thomas," she said, her voice carrying across the construction site like a confession whispered in an empty church. "There are things about Jonathan, about why he really left, about what happened during those months after Samuel died, that I've never told another living soul." Caleb rose and came to stand beside her at the window opening, his presence steady and reassuring. "I'm listening," he said simply. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decades of carefully guarded secrets pressing against her chest like stones. Ready finally to be lifted and set down, the storm arrived without warning, as mountain weather often did in late autumn. One moment, Eleanor and Caleb were working on installing roof supports. The next, they were racing to secure tools and materials as wind-driven rain began pelting the valley with increasing fury. The skeletal frame of the house offered no protection, and Caleb's cabin on the ridge was too far to reach safely. "This way," Caleb shouted over the howling wind. grabbing Eleanor's hand as lightning split the darkening sky. He led her toward a cluster of boulders at the forest edge, where years ago he'd built a small emergency shelter, little more than a lean-to, constructed of split logs and chinked with mud, but waterproof and warm. Inside the cramped space, they huddled together on Caleb's bedroll while the storm raged outside. Eleanor had never been so close to him for such an extended period, and she found herself acutely aware of his physical presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the comforting solidity of his shoulder against hers, the way his hand had lingered on hers when he'd helped her settle beside him. "I built this after a hunting trip went bad about 5 years ago," Caleb explained, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "Got caught in a blizzard and nearly froze to death before I found natural shelter. Decided I needed contingency plans for when the mountains reminded me who was really in charge." Eleanor smiled at his wry tone, but her amusement faded as she noticed something tucked into a crevice between the logs near Caleb's head. It was a small wooden cross, clearly hand-carved, with the same skill evident in all his woodwork. But this piece was different, worn smooth not by weather but by handling, and stained dark in places that suggested tears. "You carved that for Mary," she said softly, recognizing the artifact's significance without needing explanation. Caleb followed her gaze and nodded, his expression growing distant. "For her grave marker. I spent weeks getting it perfect, carving her name and the dates of her short life. Then I sat beside that grave for 3 days, trying to find words to say goodbye to someone who should have had a lifetime ahead of her." His voice carried the raw pain of remembered anguish, and Eleanor felt her heart constrict with sympathy for the depth of loss he'd endured. After the funeral, "I couldn't bring myself to leave it there. Kept thinking about winter storms and spring floods, about the cross weathering away until there was no trace left of her existence. So I brought it here, to this shelter where I come when the world feels too overwhelming to face." Eleanor reached over and gently touched the cross, feeling the smoothness of wood shaped by loving hands and polished by years of grieving touches. "I stopped believing in God the day I found their bodies," Caleb continued, his voice barely a whisper. "How could a loving creator allow such innocence to be destroyed? How could there be any justice or purpose in a world where children die and monsters prosper?" Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, wind howling through the trees with primal fury. Inside their small shelter, Eleanor felt the weight of Caleb's spiritual crisis, as if it were her own burden to bear. "I understand that anger," she said quietly. "When Samuel died, I raged at God for allowing such suffering. It seemed cruel beyond measure to give me that perfect child only to snatch him away before he could even learn to walk." She shifted closer to Caleb, their shoulders touching in the intimate confines of the shelter. "But over the years, I've come to think that maybe faith isn't about understanding God's plan or accepting that everything happens for a reason. Maybe it's about choosing to believe in love and hope and goodness despite all evidence to the contrary." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously stroking the wooden cross. "How do you hold on to hope when everything you've built can be destroyed in an instant?" "By building again," Eleanor said simply. "By refusing to let loss define you completely. By opening your heart to new possibilities even when it feels impossibly risky." As if summoned by her words, lightning illuminated the shelter's interior, and in that brief moment of stark clarity, Eleanor saw something shift in Caleb's expression. The careful distance he'd maintained, the protective barriers he'd constructed around his heart, seemed to waver like heat shimmer on summer stone. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She turned toward him, their faces inches apart in the dim shelter, and saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes, longing and fear and the tentative hope of two wounded souls, recognizing the possibility of healing in each other's presence. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate tenderness of someone who had forgotten what human connection could feel like, who had spent years believing himself beyond redemption or love. Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, tasting the salt of tears she wasn't sure belonged to him or her, or both of them together. Outside, the storm continued its fury, but inside their small sanctuary, two broken hearts began the tentative process of learning to beat in harmony once again. The morning after the storm dawned clear and crisp. With that particular quality of light that followed mountain tempests, everything washed clean and sharp-edged against the brilliant blue sky. Eleanor and Caleb worked side by side, installing the roof boards, their movements coordinated with new intimacy that spoke of the emotional breakthrough they'd shared in the storm shelter. "The angle's perfect for snow load," Caleb observed, checking the pitch of the roofline with his carpenter's eye. "Steep enough to shed heavy accumulation, but not so steep that maintenance becomes dangerous." Eleanor smiled at his practical assessment, understanding that his focus on technical details was partly his way of processing the emotional territory they'd entered together. She felt no need to rush toward definitions or declarations. The shift between them was real and profound, requiring time to settle into their daily rhythms. As they worked to secure the final row of roof boards, Eleanor's hammer struck something that rang with a different tone than wood on nail. Investigating, she discovered a small object wedged between two boards, something that must have been placed there deliberately during the original construction. "Caleb, look at this," she called, carefully extracting what proved to be a dried rose, pressed flat and brittle with age. Even after decades, traces of deep red color remained in the petals, and it had been wrapped in a scrap of silk that protected it from complete deterioration. Eleanor's hands trembled as she recognized the rose. It was from her bridal bouquet, not the simple wildflower arrangement she'd carried when she married Thomas, but the elaborate bouquet of cultivated roses that Jonathan had given her when they'd exchanged private vows in the meadow behind her parents' farm, promising themselves to each other before God, even though no minister had witnessed their commitment. "Another memory?" Caleb asked gently, seeing her emotional reaction to the discovery. "A foolish one," Eleanor said, but her voice held sadness rather than bitterness. "Jonathan gave me these roses when we pledged ourselves to each other in secret before he left for California. I saved one from the bouquet, thinking it would be something beautiful to remember our love by while he was away." She held the fragile rose up to the morning light, seeing how time had changed its substance while preserving its form. "I hid it up here when I realized he wasn't coming back. Couldn't bear to throw it away, but couldn't stand to keep it where I might see it daily. I suppose I thought someday I might want to remember that I had been truly loved once, even if that love didn't last." Caleb took the pressed rose from her hands, examining it with the same careful attention he gave to his woodworking. "It's beautiful even now. Love that strong leaves marks that time can't completely erase." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not from grief, but from the unexpected gentleness in his voice. Where another man might have felt threatened by physical evidence of her past passion, Caleb seemed to understand that her ability to love deeply was part of what made her worth loving. "I kept it as proof," she admitted. "Proof that someone had once found me worth promising forever to, even if he couldn't keep that promise. During the darkest days after Samuel died, when I felt worthless and abandoned, I would remember that rose and know that I had been precious to someone, at least for a while." Caleb carefully rewrapped the rose in its silk covering and handed it back to her. "You're precious now, Eleanor. Not as proof of past love, but as the woman you've become through surviving loss and choosing to love again despite the risk." They climbed down from the roof and stood in what would soon be Eleanor's new kitchen, surrounded by the framework of possibility they'd built together. The house was nearly complete now, lacking only the finishing touches that would transform it from shelter to home. "There's something I need to tell you," Eleanor said, gathering courage for the final revelation she'd promised during the storm, about why Jonathan really left, about what happened during those months after Samuel died. Caleb settled beside her, on the pile of lumber they'd been using as seating. His attention complete and non-judgmental. "Jonathan didn't just leave seeking gold," Eleanor continued. "He left because I told him to go. When I discovered I was pregnant, I also discovered he'd been corresponding with another woman, the banker's daughter in Sacramento he later married. He was planning to leave anyway. My condition just made his departure more urgent." She paused, forcing herself to meet Caleb's eyes. "I could have fought for him, could have demanded he honor his promises to me. Instead, I chose pride over love. I told him I wanted nothing more to do with him, that he should go to California and never contact me again. I thought I was saving my dignity, but I was really just saving myself from the humiliation of begging someone to love me." "And Samuel?" Caleb asked quietly. "He never knew his father existed. I made that choice too, to protect my son from the knowledge that his father had chosen another family over us." Eleanor's voice broke slightly. "Sometimes I wonder if that was fair to either of them." The interior finishing work progressed with a different rhythm than the earlier construction phases. Where the foundation and framing had required strength and endurance, the detail work demanded patience and precision. Eleanor found herself genuinely skilled at the finer tasks, mixing plaster to the proper consistency, cutting and fitting trim pieces, applying the linseed oil finish that would protect the wood surfaces for decades. "You have good hands for this work," Caleb observed, as Eleanor carefully mortised a hinge for the kitchen door. "Steady and sure. Thomas taught you well." "Actually, he didn't," Eleanor admitted, pausing in her work to wipe perspiration from her forehead. "Thomas was protective of me when it came to anything involving tools or construction. He meant well, but he believed a woman's place was in supporting roles rather than actual building." Caleb looked up from the cabinet he was installing, surprise evident in his expression. "Then where did you learn these skills?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed by the confession she was about to make. "From watching you these past weeks. I've been studying your techniques, asking questions when I thought you wouldn't mind, practicing when you weren't looking. I wanted to be genuinely helpful rather than just present." A slow smile spread across Caleb's weathered features. "Eleanor Whitmore, you continue to surprise me. Here I thought I was being generous by letting you help, when actually you were learning to be my equal partner." As they worked together on the final interior details, their conversation turned to practical matters of shared domesticity. Where would they place the furniture Eleanor had salvaged? How should they arrange the kitchen for maximum efficiency? Which room would serve as Caleb's workshop during winter months when outdoor construction became impossible? "There's something I'd like you to have," Eleanor said during their midday break. She disappeared into the lean-to where she'd been storing personal belongings and returned carrying a familiar wooden box. Thomas's toolbox, the one they'd rescued from the fire's destruction. "Eleanor, I can't accept this," Caleb protested. "These tools belong to your husband. They should stay in your family. They should go to someone who will honor them through use," Eleanor replied firmly. "Thomas always said tools were meant to build things, to create rather than collect dust on shelves. He would want them in the hands of a craftsman who understands their value." Caleb accepted the toolbox with the reverence of one artisan receiving the instruments of another. As he opened the familiar latches and examined each tool, Eleanor saw him testing their balance and condition with the automatic gestures of someone who understood the relationship between craftsmen and implements. "This plane," he said, lifting out the hand tool that had smoothed countless boards, "has been maintained perfectly. The blade's sharp, the body's true. Thomas took excellent care of his equipment. He spent winter evenings maintaining them," Eleanor said. "Sharpening, oiling, making small repairs. He said a craftsman's tools were extensions of his hands, and they deserved the same care he'd give to his own body." As Caleb reverently examined each piece, Eleanor felt a sense of completion that surprised her. These tools had built her first home with Thomas. Now they would finish her second home with Caleb. There was symmetry in this passing of implements, from one builder to another, from one chapter of her life to the next. "I'll use them well," Caleb promised. And I'll teach any children we might have to respect them, as Thomas would have wanted. The casual mention of future children hung in the air between them, neither shocking nor presumptuous, but simply natural, an acknowledgement that their partnership had evolved beyond the boundaries of house construction into something that encompassed a shared future. Children, Eleanor repeated softly, testing the word like someone tasting an unfamiliar but pleasant flavor. At 52, she was past the age of bearing children. But there were other ways to nurture young lives, through community involvement, through mentoring, through the kind of household that welcomed neighbors' children and traveling families, not necessarily our own, Caleb clarified gently. But children in our lives somehow. This house we're building feels like the kind of place that should echo with young voices occasionally. Eleanor looked around at the nearly completed interior, seeing it suddenly through his eyes. The kitchen was large enough for community gatherings, the main room spacious enough for celebrations, the additional bedroom ready to welcome guests or family members who might need temporary shelter. Yes, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. It does feel like that kind of house, as afternoon sunlight streamed through the new windows, illuminating the fruits of their shared labor. Eleanor felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since the early days of her marriage to Thomas. But this happiness felt different, built on complete honesty rather than careful concealment, founded on equality rather than protection, rooted in choice rather than necessity. Caleb, she said, I want you to know that building this house with you has been the most satisfying work of my life. His smile in response was radiant, transforming his weathered features with genuine joy. For me too, Eleanor. For me too. Eleanor was applying the final coat of whitewash to the interior walls when she heard hoofbeats approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visitation. Through the new kitchen window, she watched a well-dressed rider dismount from a fine bay horse, his movements carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being received favorably wherever he appeared. The man was perhaps 50 years old, with graying temples and the kind of prosperous bearing that spoke of financial success. His clothes were expensive but practical, the attire of someone who could afford luxury but chose functionality. When he removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, Eleanor's heart nearly stopped beating. Jonathan Hayes had aged well. The boyish features she remembered had matured into distinguished middle age, and success had given him the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. But his eyes were the same, warm brown with flecks of gold that had once made her believe she was looking into her future. Eleanor. His voice carried across the years with startling clarity, as if 2 decades had collapsed into a single moment. My God, Eleanor, is it really you? Caleb emerged from the lean-to where he'd been organizing tools, his expression immediately alert to the tension radiating from Eleanor's frozen posture. He moved to stand beside her, close enough to offer support, but not so close as to appear possessive or threatening. Jonathan, Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? Jonathan's eyes moved between Eleanor and Caleb, taking in the half-finished house, the obvious signs of domestic partnership. The way Caleb's presence seemed to ground Eleanor, even as she struggled with shock. I heard about the fire from a business associate in Helena, Jonathan said, approaching slowly as if moving toward a skittish animal. I came as soon as I could arrange to leave California. I wanted to make sure you were safe, to see if there was anything I could do to help. Eleanor felt a laugh bubbling up in her throat, not amusement, but the kind of desperate sound that emerges when reality becomes too absurd to process normally. 20 years, Jonathan. 20 years of silence, and you come now because of a house fire. Jonathan had the grace to look ashamed, but he pressed forward with the determination of someone who had traveled far to deliver a message. Eleanor, I know I have no right to be here, no claim on your attention or consideration, but I need you to know I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped regretting the choices I made when we were young. From his vest pocket, he produced a small leather pouch that he opened with careful hands. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a gold nugget the size of a robin's egg, polished to gleaming perfection and strung on a delicate chain. "I found this in my first claim," he said, holding the nugget up to catch the afternoon light. "It was going to be my wedding gift to you, proof that I'd succeeded in California, that I could provide the kind of life I'd promised. I've carried it for 20 years, waiting for the chance to give it to you." Eleanor stared at the golden evidence of Jonathan's success, seeing in its gleaming surface all the dreams they'd once shared and all the pain that had followed their destruction. The nugget was beautiful, valuable, exactly the kind of tangible proof of devotion that her younger self had yearned to receive. "Where were you when Samuel died?" she asked quietly. Jonathan's face crumpled as if she'd struck him physically. "I didn't know. Eleanor, I swear on everything sacred, I didn't know you'd had a child. Your letter, the one where you told me never to contact you again, I thought you meant it. I thought you'd found someone else, someone better suited to the life you wanted." "You received my letter," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The one I sent after Samuel's funeral. I told you about his birth, about his death, about how I'd waited for word from you during the most difficult months of my life." Jonathan's confusion appeared genuine, but Eleanor had learned not to trust appearances where he was concerned. "I never received such a letter," he said desperately. "Eleanor, the only communication I got from you was that first one, telling me to go to California and never look back. If I'd known about Samuel, if I'd known you needed me—" "But you didn't know," Caleb interjected quietly, "because you were already married to someone else by then, already building the life you'd chosen over the one you'd promised Eleanor." Jonathan's eyes snapped to Caleb, recognizing the protective tone of a man defending territory he considered his own. "And you are Caleb Morrison, Eleanor's partner in building this house and everything else that matters." The word partner hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Jonathan to confront the reality that Eleanor's life had moved forward during his 20-year absence. Eleanor stood in the silence that followed Jonathan's arrival, feeling the weight of 2 decades pressing against her chest like a physical burden. The man before her represented everything she had once believed about love and loyalty, but also everything she had learned about disappointment and abandonment. Caleb's steady presence beside her served as an anchor to the present, to the life she had built from the ashes of old dreams. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that we need to have a conversation that has been 20 years in the making. But it needs to be a complete conversation, Jonathan. No half-truths, no convenient omissions, no protecting each other from painful realities." She walked to the lean-to, where she kept her personal belongings, and returned with a small wooden box that she hadn't opened since the day she married Thomas. Inside, wrapped in faded blue ribbon, were the letters she had written to Jonathan during Samuel's illness, letters that had been returned to her marked "addressee unknown" and "no forwarding address." "These are the letters I sent you," she said, placing the box on the makeshift table they'd been using during construction. 3 letters, mailed over the course of 6 months, all returned unopened. The first announced Samuel's birth. The second described his illness. The third informed you of his death and burial. Jonathan stared at the returned letters with an expression of dawning horror. "Eleanor, I never saw these. I moved twice during my first year in California, following better claims and opportunities. Mail delivery was unreliable at best, and forwarding arrangements were not your priority," Eleanor finished, her voice steady but implacable. "Because you had already decided that your future lay with someone else. Tell me about your wife, Jonathan. Tell me about the woman you married 6 months after." "You left Montana Territory." Jonathan's face flushed with shame and discomfort. "How did you? News travels, even to remote territories. A banker's daughter from Sacramento, wasn't she? Someone whose family could provide the kind of connections and capital that would ensure your mining ventures succeeded. From her apron pocket, Eleanor produced the final piece of evidence she had carried for 20 years, a copy of Samuel's death certificate, yellowed with age, but still legally binding in its stark documentation of a brief life ended too soon. Samuel Jonathan Hayes, she read aloud, her voice never wavering despite the tears that blurred her vision. Born November 15th, 1862, died February 3rd, 1863, cause of death, fever. Father, Jonathan Hayes, mother, Eleanor Hayes. She held the document out to Jonathan, watching as he read his own name listed as father to a child he had never known existed. He had your eyes, Eleanor continued relentlessly, your stubborn chin, your way of sleeping with one fist curled under his cheek. For 3 months, I watched our son grow and change, and every day I told him stories about his father who would return with enough gold to build us a proper home. Jonathan sank onto the pile of lumber they'd been using as seating, the death certificate trembling in his hands as the reality of his loss settled over him like a physical weight. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, Eleanor, what have I done?" "You chose security over love," Eleanor said simply. "You chose certainty over risk, and you chose to stop trying to contact me when the correspondence became inconvenient rather than fighting to maintain our connection." Caleb had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward slightly, his presence a reminder that Eleanor was no longer the abandoned young woman who had buried her son alone. "The question," Caleb said quietly, "is what you hope to accomplish by coming here now. Eleanor has built a good life despite your absence. She's found love again, found partnership, found a future worth building. What gives you the right to disrupt that?" Jonathan looked up from the death certificate, his eyes moving between Eleanor and Caleb with the desperate calculation of a man trying to solve an impossible equation. "I came because I finally have the means to provide everything I promised her 20 years ago," he said. "Security, comfort, a life free from the hardships of frontier existence. I've built a mining empire in California, Eleanor. I can give you everything you ever wanted." Eleanor felt something cold and final settle in her chest, not anger but clarity. For 20 years, she had wondered what she would say to Jonathan if she ever saw him again. Now she knew. "What I wanted," she said, "was a partner who wouldn't abandon me when circumstances became difficult. What I wanted was someone who would fight for our love instead of choosing the easier path. What I wanted was a father for my son who would have been there to hold him while he died." She reached over and gently removed the death certificate from Jonathan's hands. "You can't give me any of those things, Jonathan, because they required you to be someone different than who you chose to become." Jonathan departed the next morning without further protest, but not before pressing the gold nugget into Eleanor's hands with a quiet plea that she keep it as an apology for all the years they had lost. Eleanor accepted it, not from any lingering affection, but because she understood that Jonathan needed to give her something, needed to feel that his journey had not been entirely worthless. Within days of his leaving, the community began arriving for what had become an unofficial tradition, the blessing of a newly completed home. Agnes Peterson came first, bearing a loaf of fresh bread and genuine warmth in her expression. The Johnsons followed with preserves from their orchard, and the Henderson family brought their fiddle for evening music. But it was the arrival of Mrs. Martha Collins and her quilting circle that truly signaled the community's acceptance of Eleanor and Caleb's partnership. Martha had organized the women of the valley to create something special for the new household, working in secret for weeks to complete their gift. "We wanted to welcome you both properly," Martha announced, as the women gathered in Eleanor's newly finished front room. "A house isn't truly a home until it's been blessed by the hands of friends." They unveiled their creation with ceremony, befitting its significance, a wedding ring quilt of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. The pattern was traditional, symbolizing eternal love and commitment. but executed with a level of skill that spoke of master seamstresses working together toward a common goal. Eleanor ran her hands over the intricate stitching, recognizing fabric pieces from dresses she'd admired in church, from shirts the men had worn to community gatherings, from children's clothing that had been outgrown but not forgotten. The quilt was literally woven from the fabric of their community, incorporating threads from every household in the valley. The center square, Martha explained, pointing to the heart of the design, includes pieces from both your wedding dress and Thomas's Sunday shirt, Eleanor. We saved them when Agnes helped you sort through donations after the fire. And here, she indicated another section, we included fabric from Sarah Morrison's sewing basket, Caleb's late wife. We thought they should both be represented in your new beginning. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at the thoughtfulness of this gesture. The quilt acknowledged her past with Thomas, while embracing her future with Caleb, honoring both relationships rather than requiring her to choose between them. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "More beautiful than anything I could have imagined." Caleb stood beside her, his own eyes bright with emotion as he studied the quilt's intricate pattern. "I've never seen finer needlework," he said. "The time and care this must have required was our pleasure to give," interrupted Mary Henderson, speaking for the group. "You've both contributed so much to our community over the years. Caleb with his craftsmanship and willingness to help with difficult construction projects, Eleanor with your teaching and nursing skills. This quilt represents our gratitude as much as our blessing." As the afternoon progressed, neighbors continued arriving with food and fellowship. The men examined Caleb's craftsmanship with professional appreciation, noting the superior foundation work and the precise joinery that would ensure the house's longevity. The women admired Eleanor's domestic arrangements, the efficient kitchen layout and the windows positioned to capture optimal light for household tasks. Children ran through the rooms with the boundless energy of youth, their laughter echoing off the new walls and bringing the kind of life to the space that Eleanor and Caleb had hoped for. Watching them play, Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with contributing to something larger than herself. "You've built more than a house here," observed Jim Johnson, as he and Caleb examined the stone foundation in the evening light. "You've built a gathering place, somewhere the community can come together for celebrations and support." Caleb nodded, understanding the compliment implicit in Jim's observation. "That was always the intention. A home should serve not just the people who live in it, but the wider community that sustains it." As night fell and neighbors began departing for their own homes, Eleanor found herself standing in her new kitchen with the community quilt draped over her arms. Overwhelmed by the generosity and acceptance she had received, "They're good people," Caleb said, joining her at the window where they could watch the last visitors making their way home by lantern light. "The best," Eleanor agreed. "I spent so many years feeling like an outsider, someone with secrets that would make me unwelcome if discovered. But they've known all along that we all have complicated histories, and they've chosen to focus on who we are now rather than who we used to be." Caleb turned toward her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "Eleanor, there's something I want to ask you, something I've been thinking about since we finished the house." She faced him fully, recognizing the gravity in his tone, the weight of whatever question he was preparing to voice. Eleanor's heart raced as she waited for Caleb's question, seeing in his expression the same nervous determination that had marked every significant moment in their relationship. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew something small wrapped in soft cloth, his hands surprisingly unsteady for someone so skilled with delicate work. "Eleanor," he began, then stopped and took a breath before starting again. "When I came down from my mountain to help you rebuild, I thought I was offering assistance to a neighbor in need. I never imagined that rebuilding your house would mean rebuilding my own capacity for hope and love." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal what appeared to be a simple wooden box. no larger than his palm, crafted from what Eleanor recognized as pieces of timber from both their original homes, her charred house beams and wood from his mountain cabin. The joinery was flawless, the surfaces polished to a warm glow that spoke of hours of careful attention. "I made this during the evenings while you were preparing supper," Caleb continued, opening the box to reveal its contents. "I wanted to create something that honored both our pasts while pointing toward our future." Inside the box lay 2 rings, not gold or silver, but carved from wood with the same meticulous craftsmanship evident in all of Caleb's work. The rings were simple in design but perfect in execution, shaped from the heartwood of an old oak tree that had stood in Eleanor's original garden. "The oak was damaged in the fire but not destroyed," Caleb explained, his voice growing more confident as he shared the story behind his creation. "I salvaged what I could and seasoned it properly. This wood has been part of your life for decades, sheltering your garden, marking the seasons of your marriage to Thomas. I thought it fitting that it should continue to be part of your story." Eleanor reached out to touch one of the rings, marveling at its smoothness and the way it seemed to capture warmth from the lamplight. The wood was a rich brown with darker grain patterns that created natural beauty, requiring no additional ornamentation. "Eleanor Whitmore," Caleb said, dropping to one knee beside her chair in the traditional posture of proposal. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not to replace what you had with Thomas, but to build something new together, something that honors both our histories while creating space for whatever future we're meant to share?" Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming rightness of this moment. Everything about Caleb's proposal reflected the man she had come to love, practical yet romantic, respectful of the past while embracing the future. Crafted with his own hands rather than purchased with money, the rings are beautiful, she said, lifting one from the box to examine its perfect proportions. "But more than that, they're right. Wood from my garden, shaped by your hands, created from materials that have meaning in our shared story." She looked up at Caleb, still kneeling beside her chair, his blue eyes holding the same mixture of hope and vulnerability that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Caleb Morrison. I will bind my life to yours and trust that together we can build something stronger than either of us could create alone." Caleb's smile in response was radiant, transforming his weathered features with pure joy. He slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, the wood warm against her skin and fitting perfectly, despite having been carved without measurements or fittings. "How did you know the size?" she asked, admiring the way the ring looked on her hand, natural and comfortable, as if it had always belonged there. "I watched your hands while we worked," Caleb admitted. "Noticed how they moved, how they held tools and materials. After 40 years of woodworking, you develop an eye for dimensions and proportions." Eleanor picked up the second ring and held it poised at Caleb's finger. "Then I believe it's my turn to make a promise." As she slipped the wooden band onto his ring finger, she spoke the words that had been forming in her heart throughout the long weeks of construction and revelation. "Caleb Morrison, I promise to be your partner in all things, in work and rest, in sorrow and joy, in the daily small tasks that build a life together, and in the great challenges that test our commitment. I promise to build with you, to grow with you, and to love you with the complete honesty that you have shown me." They sat together in the lamplight of Eleanor's new kitchen, wooden rings warming on their fingers, surrounded by the walls they had built together and the future they were choosing to create. Outside, the Montana night settled over the valley with its familiar sounds: wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the quiet murmur of a world at rest. "When shall we marry?" Eleanor asked, practical even in the midst of romantic fulfillment. "Soon," Caleb replied. "As soon as we can arrange for the minister to come from town. I've waited long enough to call you my wife. The wedding morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Eleanor's completed house and casting everything in golden radiance. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the ivory silk dress that had belonged to her mother, carefully, altered by Agnes Peterson and the other women to fit Eleanor's more mature figure while maintaining the elegant lines that had made it beautiful. 40 years earlier, the dress represented more than fashion or tradition. It was a bridge between generations, connecting Eleanor's new beginning to the love story that had created her. Her mother had worn this dress when she married Eleanor's father in 1840, full of hopes and dreams for the life they would build together. Now Eleanor would wear it to marry Caleb, carrying forward the legacy of commitment and partnership that her parents had modeled throughout their long marriage. "You look beautiful," Martha Collins said from the doorway, where she had arrived early to help with final preparations. "Your mother would be so proud to see you wearing her dress, beginning a new chapter of happiness." Eleanor touched the delicate pearl buttons that fastened the bodice, remembering her mother's stories about the dress's creation. It had been sewn by hand during the long winter before her parents' wedding, every stitch placed with care and anticipation. The silk had come from Boston, ordered specially and treasured like the precious thing it was. "I never thought I'd wear it again," Eleanor admitted. "When I married Thomas, it seemed too formal for our simple ceremony, too connected to dreams of the grand wedding I'd planned with Jonathan. But today, it feels exactly right." Through the window, Eleanor could see neighbors arriving for the ceremony, carrying covered dishes and wearing their finest clothes. The entire community had embraced the celebration, understanding that Eleanor and Caleb's marriage represented more than the union of two individuals. It symbolized healing, second chances, and the power of love to transform loss into new beginning. Agnes Peterson appeared in the bedroom doorway, slightly breathless from her morning preparations. "The minister arrived from town an hour ago," she announced. "Reverend Matthews says he's honored to perform the ceremony in your new home. And Caleb asked me to tell you that he's never been so nervous or so happy in his entire life." Eleanor smiled at this message, picturing Caleb in whatever fine clothes he'd managed to assemble for their wedding day. They had agreed on a ceremony that would be dignified but not elaborate, meaningful rather than showy, a reflection of who they had become rather than who they thought they should be. As she made final adjustments to her appearance, Eleanor's eyes fell on the wooden jewelry box where she kept her most precious belongings. Inside, carefully wrapped, lay Thomas's pocket watch, stopped forever at the moment of his death. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of that frozen time, unable to move beyond the moment when her first chapter of love had ended. Now, as she prepared to marry Caleb, Eleanor made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She lifted the pocket watch from its resting place and gently wound the mechanism, watching as the hands began their steady movement once again. Time, she realized, was meant to flow forward, not remain trapped in moments of loss. "It's time," Martha said softly. Recognizing the significance of Eleanor's gesture with the watch, Eleanor took one final look in the mirror, seeing not the young woman who had first worn this dress in dreams of marrying Jonathan, nor the grieving widow who had put it away after Thomas's death, but the mature woman she had become through surviving both love and loss. The dress fit her differently now, not just because of altered measurements, but because she filled it with different hopes, different understanding of what marriage could mean. Downstairs, the main room of her new house had been transformed into a wedding chapel. Caleb stood beside the stone fireplace they had built together, wearing a dark suit that emphasized his strong shoulders and made his blue eyes appear even more striking. His hair and beard had been trimmed for the occasion, but his expression held the same steady warmth that had drawn Eleanor to him from the beginning. As she walked toward him, Eleanor felt the weight of her mother's dress settling around her like a blessing. Behind her, the wooden floors they had installed together creaked familiarly under her feet. Ahead of her, Caleb waited with an expression of such complete love and acceptance that Eleanor felt her heart expand to contain more happiness than she had thought possible at her age. The community that had embraced them both stood witness as Reverend Matthews began the ceremony, but Eleanor's attention focused entirely on Caleb's face, seeing in his eyes the promise of all the tomorrows they would build together. "Dearly beloved," the minister's voice rang through the room they had constructed with their own hands. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the union of Eleanor Whitmore and Caleb Morrison, two hearts that have found in each other the completion of love's true purpose." Winter settled over the valley with the kind of thorough completeness that only mountain country could deliver, wrapping Eleanor and Caleb's new home in silence, broken only by the crackle of their stone fireplace and the gentle whisper of snow against the windows they had so carefully installed. The house proved itself admirably during the season's first serious storm, the deep foundation and superior construction techniques protecting them from the worst of the weather's fury. Eleanor discovered that marriage to Caleb differed profoundly from her life with Thomas, not because one was better than the other, but because she herself had changed so fundamentally in the years between. Where her first marriage had been built on gratitude and gentle companionship, this union thrived on complete equality and passionate partnership. They shared household tasks without discussion of propriety, worked side by side on winter projects without concern for traditional gender roles, and spent long evenings in conversation that ranged from practical planning to philosophical speculation. During the quiet months of January and February, when outdoor work became impossible and social visiting decreased to essential contacts only, Eleanor and Caleb developed the rhythm of domestic partnership that would define their shared life. Caleb used Thomas's tools to craft furniture for their home, a dining table that could accommodate community gatherings, chairs built to last generations, storage cabinets designed to Eleanor's specific needs and preferences. Eleanor, meanwhile, discovered talents she hadn't known she possessed. With encouragement from Caleb, she began keeping a detailed record of their daily life together, documenting not just practical matters like weather and household tasks, but also the small moments of connection and growth that marked their deepening relationship. The shared journal became their most treasured possession, a leather-bound volume that Caleb had crafted specifically for Eleanor's writing. Each evening after supper, they would sit together by the fire while Eleanor recorded the day's events in her careful script, often asking Caleb for his perspective on matters they had discussed or decisions they had made together. February 15th, 1883, Eleanor wrote, as snow swirled past their kitchen window. Caleb completed the new bookshelf today, with adjustable shelves designed to accommodate both my teaching materials and his technical manuals. We spent the evening organizing our combined library, discovering that we share more intellectual interests than either of us had realized. His books on engineering and construction complement my volumes on literature and pedagogy in ways that suggest our partnership extends beyond the practical into the realm of genuine intellectual companionship. She paused in her writing, looking across the table at Caleb as he worked on carving wooden handles for the kitchen utensils Eleanor had requested. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and she found herself marveling at how completely natural their domestic life had become. "What are you writing about tonight?" he asked, glancing up from his carving with the small smile that never failed to warm Eleanor's heart. "About how different this winter feels from the ones I spent alone," she replied honestly. "About how sharing daily life with someone who truly sees and values me has changed my understanding of what marriage can be." Caleb set down his carving tools and reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb tracing the wooden ring that had become as natural a part of her as breathing. "I never expected to feel this content again," he said quietly. "After Sarah and Mary died, I thought the capacity for domestic happiness had died with them. But what we've built together isn't a replacement for what I lost. It's something entirely new, something I couldn't have imagined when I was younger. Eleanor squeezed his hand, understanding exactly what he meant. Their love didn't diminish the relationships they had loved and lost. Instead, it honored those earlier chapters by proving that the human heart could expand to encompass multiple forms of happiness without betraying any of them. "Do you think," she asked, "that we're setting a good example for the younger couples in our community, showing them that marriage can be a true partnership rather than a traditional hierarchy?" Caleb considered her question seriously, as he did all matters that touched on their role in the larger community. "I hope so," he said finally. "I'd like to think that watching us work together as equals might encourage other couples to find their own balance, their own way of sharing responsibilities and supporting each other's individual strengths." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them of the harsh world beyond their warm sanctuary. Inside, Eleanor continued writing in their shared journal, documenting not just the facts of their life together, but the emotional landscape of a marriage built on honesty, equality, and the kind of deep partnership that could weather any storm. "This house," she wrote, "has become more than shelter. It's become the physical manifestation of everything we've learned about love, loss, and the courage required to begin again." Spring arrived early that year, with the mountain snowpack melting into rushing streams and the valley floor emerging from winter's grip like a world reborn. Eleanor and Caleb emerged from their winter cocoon of domestic intimacy to find their marriage had deepened and strengthened during the months of enforced closeness, proving that their partnership could thrive under any circumstances. The first major task of the new season was the creation of Eleanor's garden, but this time with a difference. Where her original garden had been practical and productive, focused primarily on vegetables and herbs needed for household survival, this new growing space would be designed as a collaboration between Eleanor's knowledge and Caleb's engineering skills. "I want to plant something that will outlast us both," Eleanor said as they surveyed the cleared space behind their completed house. "Something that will still be growing and giving pleasure long after we're gone from this valley." Caleb nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. They had both reached the age where legacy became as important as daily survival, where the urge to create something permanent competed with the simple pleasure of living well in the present moment. Together, they selected a spot with optimal exposure to morning sun and protection from harsh afternoon winds. The location was visible from their kitchen window, ensuring that Eleanor could monitor the tree's progress during her daily household tasks, but far enough from the house that its eventual size wouldn't interfere with the structure or foundation. The oak sapling they chose was no bigger around than Caleb's thumb, a fragile thing that seemed unlikely to survive its first winter, much less grow into the mighty tree they envisioned. But Eleanor had learned patience through years of tending growing things, and Caleb understood that the most important construction projects required faith in futures that might not be witnessed by their builders. "My grandfather planted an oak on his property when my father was born," Caleb said, as they prepared the planting hole with careful attention to drainage and soil composition. "By the time I left Pennsylvania, that tree was large enough to shade the entire front yard. 3 generations of children had climbed its branches and built forts in its canopy." Eleanor smiled at the image, imagining unknown children decades in the future, discovering the tree she and Caleb were planting, using its branches for adventures they couldn't yet imagine. "This tree will be our legacy," she said, gently placing the sapling's roots in the prepared hole. "Proof that we were here, that we built something together, that our love created beauty that will endure long after our names are forgotten." As they filled in the soil around the young tree's roots, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with finishing a task and everything to do with accepting her place in the larger cycle of growth, change, and continuity. This tree would mark the spot where Eleanor Whitmore and Caleb Morrison had chosen to invest their hope in a future they would not live to see, Do you think we'll live long enough to see it reach full size? Caleb asked, pressing the soil firmly around the base of the sapling. Probably not, Eleanor admitted with surprising equanimity. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is planting it anyway, trusting that someone will care for it after we're gone, believing that beauty and growth are worth investing in, even when we can't control the outcome. They finished the planting in companionable silence, both understanding that they had just completed something more significant than a simple gardening task. As Eleanor watered the newly planted oak with careful attention to the amount and placement of moisture, she felt the satisfaction that came from participating in something larger than individual desire or immediate need. The house they had built together would shelter future families, but it would also eventually need replacement or major renovation. The love they had found in their mature years would inspire others, but would end with their own lives. But this tree, if properly tended and protected, could grow for centuries, providing shade and beauty and ecological benefit to generations they would never meet. There, Eleanor said, stepping back to admire their work. The sapling looked impossibly small and vulnerable in its new location, but she could envision its future growth with the clarity that came from understanding the patient rhythms of natural development. Standing beside the newly planted oak, Eleanor and Caleb surveyed the life they had built together, the house constructed with their own hands, the garden beginning to show signs of spring growth, the community of neighbors who had embraced their unconventional love story. It was a good life, honest and productive, and filled with the kind of deep satisfaction that came from building something meaningful rather than simply acquiring it. No regrets? Caleb asked, following her gaze across their shared domain. None, Eleanor replied without hesitation. This is exactly the life I was meant to live.